were some of your earliest memories?
My name's Bob Nelson, Robert J. or Joseph Nelson Jr., and I was born in Lexington, Kentucky, on September the 30th, 1939. My name was supposed to be David, but my father, who was absolute about his convictions that I was going to be a junior, so Robert Joseph Nelson Jr. it is. And Lexington was at that time, still is, 70 miles from our home, Somerset. And I was raised there during the Second World War. And my father was in the military, was on a boat called USS Skylark, which was sunk in Tokyo Bay in 1944. And I have a lot of stories about things that my dad had told me about the service. And later on in my life, I ran into one of his friends who actually had pulled him out of Tokyo Bay when his minesweeper was sunk. And I was a freshman at the University of Kentucky and was trying to sell magazines door to door, and knocked on this door, and a man answered, and he said, "Joe Nelson's boy, what are you doing here?" And I couldn't believe that the world was that small. And then he told me about pulling my father out of Tokyo Bay and throwing him a life jacket. And of course, I had to check that whenever I got back home. It was true. And those kind of things have seemed to, whet my appetite for what I became later in my life as an evangelist and storyteller. So I was able to take those events and sort of make them palatable for whoever I was talking with. After I left Somerset, I came to the University of Kentucky. I wasn't ready to go to the University of Kentucky like many students that get through a small town high school without really having to do a whole lot of homework. And so when I landed in Lexington at the university, I found out real quick that most of my teachers and most of my subjects were at least impatient with the fact that I had not complied with their wishes and had not made very good grades.
Let me interrupt you a little bit.
Sure.
Let me back you up some. So did you have any brothers and sisters, or?
Sure. Oh, I forgot.
Yeah, that's okay.
My family was still in Somerset when I was at the university, and I had two brothers. Each of my brothers are 6 years apart. I'm 6 years older than Gary and 12 years older than Sam Parker. And I don't know what that says about my mother and my father and their passion for each other, but we were 6 years apart, and we are very close today. I'm proud of both of them. My Gary was a born musician and could have played for the University of Kentucky band in many, many instruments. And finally, they needed an oboe player, and he could do that. And so he made 1 year of college at the university by playing in the band. And then my younger brother is a businessman, and his name is Sam, and he is an officer with Fazoli's restaurant chain, and was the one person who went out across the country for months at a time, finding restaurants that hadn't done well, and they were going out of business, and he would then turn that business into Fazoli's. He lives here in Lexington, as does my middle brother Gary. So we see each other lots.
What was it like in your house growing up?
Well, it was a little loud at times. One of my favorite memories happened on Christmas Eve. my brother and I shared a room. My youngest brother was a baby, and we had a fireplace in the house, and my father had he liked to spit in the fire, and he would sit close to it, and he had been doing that while he was watching a boxing match or something that evening. And of course, being Christmas Eve, there was some activity going on beside the boys being in bed. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, I awoke in the bedroom shared with my middle brother Gary, and the place was filled with smoke. And I got up and said, Gary, the house is on fire. And he was always a deep sleeper, but he did get out of the bedroom and went into the bathroom to relieve himself. And I was trying to wake my mom and dad up, and that time a little panic had set in, and they sent us next door to stay with the Gregorys who lived there. And they, of course, we woke them up, and here it was on Christmas Eve, and the firemen came, and I never will forget, my dad said to the firemen as they were opening up the roof to get he said, why don't you just hack through a couple of more sides of those shingles and I can get a new roof. And I don't think the firemen were that pleased with the statement, but anyway, that was an exciting Christmas Eve.
What did you mean your house was loud at times?
Well, I mean that when my mom and my dad were there trying to deal with three sons, my father, I think, always took the side that my mother was not on, and so she could hold her own in those let me say more than mild debates. And my father would soon get tired of it, and he either would just walk out of the house and deep breathe for a while, or go to bed and say, I've had all that I need tonight of conversation. But most of in our house, it was a wonderful time. The brothers were 6 years apart, as I said, and my youngest brother he got hurt a lot. He would, I remember one time I was chasing him. I was holding a bicycle, and he ran around the corner of the house and doubled back, and he ran right into the pedal, and the pedal guard was off, and he suffered a scar up in the top of his head. And my youngest brother, being 12 years younger than I am, we were not friends until we were adults. And it didn't mean that we didn't love each other. We were very close as brothers. And the sister-in-laws that were finally there, and I really enjoyed that about our family growing. Somerset is the poet laureate, or the writer of the history of the state of Kentucky, says that in the 50s Somerset was a town in recession, because where my grandfather worked, the Ferguson shops made box cars and wheels for the box cars back during the Second World War. And the railroad was big industry there until the mid-50s. And of course, Somerset, a town of, I don't know, maybe 2,500 people. And the 50s hit. And I was a dancer, and I fell in love with the woman that's my wife today, and we won every dance contest in the state of Kentucky. And that got me kicked out of the First Baptist Church, to the chagrin of my mother, devout Baptist. And I decided that I would just go to church in the Disciples of Christ Church, because I knew they didn't care whether I danced or not. And that was where my wife played the piano. So we had a good romance in high school.
So did you get along with your mother and father?
Oh yes, I got along with them. Well, I got along with my mother because my father saw to it. But no one in our family was ever mean. My mother and her sister, Catherine, her only sister, both went to the Sayre School here in Lexington, Kentucky, and they became dancers and dancing teachers, the kind of where the little children dress up like ducks, and they made the uniforms, and my wife was one of those dancers. And I remember in the wintertime I would go into my aunt's house, and I would watch the girls and the little boys dance and getting ready for their recitals. But I don't really have any bad memories about my childhood.
So your mother went to the Baptist church? Is that what you said?
Went to First Baptist Church, yes.
Did your father go to church?
He was not a churchman. He went to college in the name of the college escapes me. It was in Winchester, like a junior college. He went there for a while. He went to Eastern for a while, and I think he even went to Western Kentucky to finish a year. I don't believe he ever finished college, and I think that was because of the Second World War. I do know that my mother said that my father was so small, a small-boned and just a small man, that he ate bananas for over a month in order to gain enough weight that the Navy would take him. And I wondered when I heard the story about his ship being sunk, if it was worth the bananas.
So you said earlier that you spent a lot of time with your grandmother. Was it great grandmother?
And my grandfather.
Okay.
And my mother moved from Somerset during the Second World War, the last 2 years of the war, that we all lived together in Oakdale, Tennessee.
So just to make sure I understand, so your father left for the service, he was in the Navy, and then during that time, that's when you lived with your grandmother?
In Oakdale, Tennessee, yes.
Was that just to have somebody to live with, to help take care of?
I think so. I think it was my mother was out, there was no job, and so my mother moved with me to Oakdale. She and my grandmother were adversaries at time over who was supposed to run the house, but later on in life, I recognized that was probably true in 90% of the houses at that time. We had two homemakers, two women of the house in the same place, and I was not the only grandchild that was there. My brothers came, or at least my brother Gary, the closest to me in age, came, and there was another family, my father's sister's family, and they had two children, a boy and a girl, and they came to Oakdale during that same time in the Second World War. And later on in my life, it was the stories that I remembered from 1942, 1945, during the Second World War, that I believe gave my preaching not only authenticity, but humor as well, because we remembered later on some of the very funny things that happened with wooden telephones and other things like that.
So you would have been, 8 to 10, 12 years old?
Yes.
Okay. What did your parents do? What did they do for a living?
My father, after the war, after he got back from the Navy, he actually went to New York, and he worked as a postman there in the Armed Forces Post Office in Queens, I think. And I was just a baby, and so I went with my mother there. I have no recollection of any other than stories that she told me. And I don't remember much about being in Somerset, even when my father came home. My main memories that fed the stories of my preaching came during the Second World War in Oakdale, Tennessee.
That's good. Do any
Sure.
Wouldn't-
I didn't think you were ever going to ask. One of my favorite stories about Oakdale, and a story that stayed with me all the way years later after my grandmother passed away. I still remember this story, and when I graduated from Asbury College at the ripe age of 41, something like that, I was asked in a seminary class to tell a story. And I remembered that in Oakdale, we had a large tree in the front yard, and I noticed one day that there was a square had been carved in that tree with a penknife. And a little time elapsed, and my grandmother's house had a back porch, and in that back porch you entered from the kitchen, from the outdoor onto a pantry into a kitchen. And one day a man knocked on the door, and I ran to the door. My grandmother would always stop me, and the doors were always latched. And here was a man standing outside, and he had on a cap pulled down over his ears. It was chilly, almost fall, late fall, and he had on. It looked to me like several. What would we call them? T-shirts or sweatshirts, and maybe 2 jackets and 2 pairs of pants and heavy, maybe military shoes. And he would say to my grandmother, "Is there anything you would need, ma'am? I'll be glad to do work for food." And my grandmother would say, "Well, yes, I have these stones that are here beside my steps, and I wonder if it'd be too much bother for you if you move. I want to have a garden here in the spring, and so I need those stones moved." And he would move the stones, and when he did, my grandmother would let him come in on the back porch, and she would feed him. And during the Second World War, the meat of the day for America was fried chicken, and we had our own chicken cooks, and so she would fix him a meal. But before she would give him the fork, she would say, "Let's pray," and she would have a prayer with him, and then he would get up and either do the work, or he had already done the work, and he would thank her. And I can remember that he would take that the toboggan cap when she would say, "Let's pray," and he'd put that over his heart. And I couldn't ever remember whether that was to thank her or thinking about the soldiers and the sailors that were going. So, there would be 3 or 4 weeks go by, and then somebody would come and look just like his brother, have this, a different color cap, a different shirt, and he would say, "Is there anything I can do, ma'am? I'm hungry." And she'd say, "Well, yes, I'd like you to move these stones from here over to here, because in the spring I want." And that would go on and on and on, after one man after the other would come. And one day, I wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed anyway, and so one day it dawned on me that my grandmother was feeding these people, but there wasn't going to be a garden, and I accused her of that. I said, "Granny, you're feeding these men, but there's no garden." And she'd look at me and she said, "But you still make them work." And she said, "You want to remember this, Rob, that work," what is the saying? I'll have to stop the tape. That food tastes better when you work for it. And I remembered that into my preaching, and that was my very first illustration I did in seminary. And when one of my fellow students heard it, he invited me to come to his little church in Garrett County, Kentucky, to preach a revival. That was my first revival that I ever preached. And it came through an Oakdale, Tennessee, Second World War story. And I don't know, my rest of my ministry, I seemed like that at that time, there were always those stories that percolated through, and people enjoyed the age of the of the church member in the year 2000, they were right at that age. They remembered the Second World War, and they remembered some of the hardships and some of the tragedies and so forth. So that became, fodder for the mill, and those are the stories that I used.
That's good. Let me take a second just to check
Yeah. Or that coffee if it's still there. No. The what?
You want me to freshen it up? She says don't forget Toby.
Okay.
The reason we got Toby is because we got that picture of your granddad with Jimmy Duck.
Right. Did you show it to him?
No, I haven't.
Okay. All right.
Well, there were several things.
Yeah, go ahead.
Several things that I recalled, and it was years later when I never dreamed that I was going to be a preacher and needed all these illustrations. But I think in God's time, after I was converted and when I studied at Asbury College, I was 39 when I entered, and by the time I got through the seminary on the other side of the street, I was 45, and so I found out that I was retaining a lot of the stories, and they became really the bedrock of my whole ministry, because the people, they were my age or maybe a generation or even two older, and they seemed hungry for stories from that era, other than the movie stars and the radio programs and so forth that everybody remembered. But my grandfather was an engineer, and sometimes they would let me crawl up in bed with him, and he and my grandmother would be asleep, and they were in a great big bed, and I'd either feign that I was afraid or cold or something, and they knew that, of course. But this one time, my grandfather seemed to welcome me to come in and sleep between them like that, and he said, I have a surprise for you. You need to go to sleep, because we're going to do something special in the morning. And I didn't know what special was, and so that next morning, we did get up extra early. At his go to work time was about 4 a.m. and he took me up to what's called the yard, and that's the part of a railroad terminal where we had in Oakdale, Tennessee, halfway between Lexington and Chattanooga, or Danville and Chattanooga, and it was a place where you could get your engine would go on that round, and then the thing was called a roundhouse. It turned the engine around and go back south or vice versa. And so since this was going to be a short trip, he had arranged with the engineer for me to ride up in the cab of one of the latter steam engines before the diesels came along. And so he they put me up, he handed me, I still have a picture, it's here in the house someplace, of one of my grandfather's friends holding me up on the ladder, and the engineer or the fireman one picking me up and setting me in this, what looked like a tractor seat. It's full of holes, it was a metal, and of course trains these trains at least, didn't have a roll-up window. It was just a hole in the metal. And so the man set me in that seat, and I can remember looking down to see how far it was to the ground. It seemed like what was going to happen, and then we hadn't moved yet, and I could feel the train rumble a little. But all of a sudden, I saw the fireman, and he put both hands on it, and he let the brake go, and they were pouring coal into the hopper, and the big wheels began to, but they slipped, and I didn't realize that time, I was just a child, that in order to make a train go, no matter how big they are, you have to put little grains of sand underneath the wheels so you have friction. And I didn't know very much about friction at that time, but I remember going out of that yard, and the train would go back and forth and back and forth. And as we went by my grandfather's house, my grandmother was standing on the porch waving, and I was trying to wave and hold on at the same time. And the train went down around the Emory River, and which flowed right behind my grandmother's house, and down. And all of a sudden, I saw this big hole in the side of this mountain, and I thought, "Oh, we're not going to get through this thing." And I tell my audiences that, little boys mean well, but they don't have any way to relate to the things that they see first. And it just seemed like that big old train would never get into that tunnel. And of course, when we got into it, we were all covered with black smoke and soot because there were no windows in there to shut. And that didn't bother me a bit. I was used to being dirty. But that was a great adventure, and I remember that having a broomstick horse, which I had named Toby, and I exercised that horse every day as those steam engines would come by, and I would get over in one corner of the yard, and I'd try to wait till the very first part of that engine would get even with me, and then I'd take off running. And I remember after I got home that night, and my grandmother was asking me about everything, kissed me goodnight, put me in bed, and I got up and went over in the closet and pulled that stick horse out, and I said, "Toby, we ain't never going to catch that train." And the people seemed to like that story. And
Sure. That's good. So you lived there until?
I'd say when was the war over for everybody? Probably 45. They were still coming back home, and I don't actually remember. I remember much more about Oakdale than I do in my family home in Somerset, which is still there. I stayed in that house until I graduated high school and went away, and my mother and father lived there for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years after I left, and then they moved to Lexington. But I don't know.
So you went to high school. Where'd you go to high
Somerset
school?
High School.
You were back
Right.
in Somerset.
Yeah, we lived less than an 8-iron from the back end of the school, and I had a little alley that I went through across the street, neighbor's yard, and I was on a football field, so I walked back and forth to school every day, as did both my brothers.
Right. What kinds of things did you do in high school?
Well, I fell in love with my wife. That was before high school. That was in the 8th grade. She was in the 7th, and she wouldn't look at me. She didn't really think a whole lot of me, and I don't know why. I think the Lord just wanted me to be with her. So I gave her a little Valentine one time as we were passing, the 7th graders going one way and 8th the other, and I handed her a little note that said, "I love you. I'm going to marry you." And she threw it in the floor, and I picked it up, and when we were married, I wrote on the bottom of that little note, "I told you so," and put it in her marriage certificate. And we dated off and on in high school. That was back, you remember, the 1956, 57, 58, that was Elvis's years, and the American Bandstand. And so I was a Baptist at the time, and I remember they came to town and we had a big dancing contest. And my wife and I had won that we went out to the National Guard Armory and won a trip to Lexington, and we were going to be on TV and everything. The preacher, the Baptist preacher, kicked me out of the church, and I couldn't be a Baptist anymore, so I went down. I tell everybody I went down to the Camelot Church. They didn't care whether I danced or not.
So the preacher actually came to you and said,
"Yeah, you can't come here anymore." Yeah. You want me to name him? I can tell you his name. He died about 15 years after that, so he's been in heaven a long time. But
how'd you get into dancing?
well, it was the 50s, everybody that I knew danced, and we had we really didn't have any place. This is a time, and you won't remember that this is a time of Elvis Presley, and even before that, where you had 4 African Americans called the Ink Spots, or the I don't know. There were so many names of those groups back then. In Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock movie, that honored those first singers. I forget the female singer that was so good, and I'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, we would listen in my house. My mother would not, bless her heart, my mother did not think a whole lot of African Americans, and neither did her father, who was my grandfather, who was a mortician. And but I would sneak and listen to it on the radio at night. It came from Gatlin, Tennessee, Gallatin, Tennessee, and they were all the early rock and roll. And then I remember in fact, that we have it here somewhere, is Blue Moon of Kentucky, which was Elvis's first CD, first 45, and we have it. In fact, we probably have, Ann probably has all of Elvis's records, either 45, or at that time you have to remember that you couldn't go to a party and be sure that they were going to have a record player that would match your records until later. In about 1959, somebody, RCA, fixed a little post that would play 45s, 78s, and 33s, play them all. And so those were fun times for kids that were 15, 16, 17 years old, right before we all left town to go to school.
How'd you get so good at dancing? Did you just practice all the time?
Well, we had a lot of rhythm, and we listened to the music, and Ann was a dancing teacher. And so they had there was a fella here in Lexington named Lynn Carl, and he would go around the state, and he'd take pictures of these sock hops, they were called. And when Ann and I danced in the year that we won, we danced in the National Guard Armory, which was 100 yards from her house. And we would do, I'd throw her over my back, and just all the same thing that you saw on Philadelphia. And everywhere we went, we would be the first people that, if it was a cafeteria at the school, they said, we're going to have a sock hop at the school. And there was a lot of that going on. And some of the parents objected, but most of them didn't. And we all knew each other. It was a small town. And if you were angry, you didn't want to dance with anybody anyway. And the Baptist preacher had stopped us from not only, he didn't want us dancing. That's when I left the Baptist church, and then we began square dancing. And we tried to square dance in the Methodist parking lot, and the Methodist preacher was against square dancing. So Somerset was like an anti-dancing place, even though that's where we learned to dance. We found a place to dance anyway, and so we'd go to one of these, other places. And we had, it's like watching, one of these television programs where they had all the little boys and the gals, and we had a milkshake place out on the Beltline, that we went to called, one of them was called Red's Drive-In, and the other one was called Finley's, and Finley's is still there. And you could go circle Finley's. That was a big thing that everybody did. And I have a real good friend that's a publisher of the New York Times. He just started smoking, and he thought that was the grandest thing in the world, that he could hold a cigarette and light it with a lighter. And then he was talking while he was showing us how that worked, and he flipped it out the window, except the window was rolled up. And he's now the publisher of the New York Times. So, and we had a very special class. Ann's class and my class had several people in it that became not only very wealthy, but had big jobs, and in the history of America. One of them was in the nuclear, he sold nuclear reactors. And he had always been, he was a very smart, he was Catholic. And back in Somerset, we probably didn't have, we had maybe 2 or 3 Jewish families there, because one of the older of the Goldenbergs had come to Somerset with a pack on his back and started a furniture store. So Somerset was was a small town that was, the author here of Kentucky's history was correct about the beginning was strictly railroad. And then the people began to percolate and do some of the things that Ann's grandmother and my grandmother could talk about. Well, those were good times, and it was a wonderful time to grow up, as opposed to today. If there were any drugs being sold in Somerset until 1958, I don't know about it. And I knew a lot about the people down there. Nobody had started. Very few people smoked, and alcohol was you had to sneak it into town by somebody else. So it was a fairly safe place to raise your children, unlike today.
Did you do anything else in high school?
Well, I started a golf team. I was a golfer. I started caddying, and a lady that lived across the street from me was a very good golfer. She was one of the top female golfers in the state of Kentucky, and she wanted to have what's called a Central Kentucky women's golf tournament. But we didn't have any caddies. This would still have been about 1943, and everything was segregated. But it just so happened that I guess that happened later. In the 50s, 1956, the Somerset High School Dunbar basketball team won the national championship. They also won it again in 1957 and beat a team from Paris, Kentucky. And to have 3 basketball teams that win national championships in the state of Kentucky sort of solidified Kentucky as a basketball state, even if you didn't know about Adolph Rupp and the Wildcats, which I kept up with. I listened to every game of the undefeated season that Coach Rupp had on the radio, and I kept circling every single win. And somewhere, when I went into the service and my mother cleaned the house, some of those treasures that I had got pitched somewhere. And my wife and I were in Cooperstown, New York. 3 years ago, I'd preached 2 camp meetings up there, and we stopped by Cooperstown. And in Cooperstown, there's a great big sign in one of the windows of the baseball card collectibles. It said, "We have all the cards your mother threw away," which was exactly what happened to us. Well, when I was in college, my friend John Fitzwater, who was he really is a brilliant guy, and he's the man with a newspaper. And he had always, if he graduated high school, he went to work for a newspaper, and they sent him to California, and he stayed with the New York Times system, and he made it really to the top. He turned down a job in Boston because it's too cold, and now he's the head of the newspaper, New York Times newspaper in Lakeland, Florida, which is a tough place, to get by. So I mean, it's just very wealthy, and I forget what question you asked me, but he was one of our friends, and that we're proud of. You'd asked me a question.
Youth Center.
Yeah, and when I went to college, we had asked this fellow that had an old, I believe it was a Western Auto store, and up above on the second floor. And when we went to college that summer, my friend John and I decided that we were going to open up a place to dance for the kids to dance, regardless of the Methodist and the Baptist preacher. And so we did. We leased that for almost nothing. And we talked the man that put records in all the jukeboxes. we talked him into bringing a jukebox up there and giving us the free music, and we selected all of those dominoes and those, that was back in still in the Elvis era. And so I can remember they had a contest for the king and queen of Somerset for the juniors or whatever they call it, and my wife and my friend John both won. And I don't remember. I think I'd flunked out of college, and I don't know why I flunked out. I only missed class 43 or 44 straight days, and it's hard for me to wake up because I stayed up all night. And I remember the day just like it was yesterday that I knew my dad was coming. I said, "You've got to get this alarm where you can beat him. You don't want him to catch you asleep." So I turned this metal wastebasket over, and then I took a big box of matches and set this alarm clock that had a crazy ring to it on top of the matches down in the metal basket, thinking, it's going to make enough noise. And I slept right through it, and the first sound I remember was my dad saying, "Okay, it's time for you to get up, unplug that alarm clock, and get your stuff ready. We're leaving." And I thought, "Oh, where are we going?" And they had gotten, 20 letters from the dean saying Bob's not here and he's not there. We don't know where he is. And the next thing I knew, I was standing in front of the recruitment office for the United States Army in Louisville. And they handed me shoes, underwear, filled that duffel bag up. I could hardly pick it up. Put me on a train to St. Louis, and I ended up in Fort Hood, Texas, 1 week after Elvis left to go to Germany.
Wow. So, let me ask a couple things to get back. I can't remember. Did Cricket say you were a cheerleader? Was that
In high school,
Yeah.
I was.
How did that happen?
Well, I was picked by the student body as they picked Ann and myself. And I don't remember what they picked Ann for. Smartest kid in the universe, I guess. And for me, I don't know what mine was. It was either my personality or my ignorance or something. But the kids do that in high schools. And so all of my friends that were jocks asked me, we had a male cheerleader before, and so they said, we want another male cheerleader. You can do it. And I had made up some sort of a cheer, but not thinking that I was going to be out in the middle of a basketball floor leading it. But I'd made it up, and it was called the Spirit Cheer or something, yell or something. I don't even remember how it went. But next thing I knew, I was standing in front of crowds all over eastern Kentucky, and you can imagine. But Ann has a cousin who was a prize fighter. And because Ann was my girlfriend, I got the benefit of a Big Ed. What was his last name? Strunk. Big Ed, which is her name, Ann Strunk. And so he would go with me to the ball games, and we fight. I mean, we'd get in a fight, and Ed would just stand back and just knock people out. So till they got tired, and said, this is hopeless. Let's let the kid go. So I was pretty much safe for at least that year.
Was he in high school with you?
Oh yeah, he was ahead of us, but he was the kind of the high school student that either did go or didn't go or whoever. He ended up in the Navy, and I don't know whatever happened to him.
So Ann, whenever you first told her in 8th grade, she brushed you off.
Oh, terrible! Yeah.
When did you officially start dating?
Well,
How did that happen?
when we started dancing,
Started dancing?
yeah, she got old enough to dance. But it was that's what everybody did in the 50s. I mean, it was just a wonderful time to be young. And we started dancing together, and then we'd go to parties together. Her dad had a big boat that would go out on the Lake Cumberland. We'd go spend a lot of time together.
So you graduated high school?
Oh yeah,
Yep. And
went in the Army.
well, yeah, so you went to college first or before that?
I was really very. I didn't go to class much.
Right. Now, what was driving that?
I just didn't want to go, or a lot of other things going on. There's a lot of new things that happen to you when you leave Somerset and go to. You've got to try see if you can smoke a cigarette without choking yourself. You got to try that. So, and then driving back and forth, my dad had a 1952 Buick, and so I'd get in that. I hitchhiked off halfway around the United States of America, and Ann's daddy tried to get her away from me, so since I go in the Army, and they sent me to Maryland. And so Mr. Strunk decides that a smart thing to be would send her to Texas Christian University, since she was going to the First Christian Church. So then the Army moved me to Fort Hood, Texas. And so I hitchhiked and rode a bus all the way to Texas Christian University and went to this the woman that was the head of the girls' dorm, who Ann said was just death on boys when they showed up. She was a protector of all the females that were there. Well, when I knocked on the door and she opened the door and saw how tiny I was only about, I don't know how tall I was back then, probably 5'3", and didn't weigh 120 pounds. I went into service at 121, and here I've got this little uniform on, and she started crying. She said, "Well, come on." That old woman was so mad that she invited me in. Ann said none of her friends could believe it. But so I guess I looked harmless.
That's good. What college was it that you were at first? Was it UK?
University of Kentucky.
Okay, so you were at UK first.
Very short-lived.
Yeah, didn't make it long there.
No.
Okay, so then your dad signed you up, or you end up
Went in the
signed up,
service.
going in the service.
Yeah.
And where'd you go from there?
So Mr. Strunk sends Ann to TCU, and the Army sends me to Fort Hood. I'm in Fort Hood the week following Elvis Presley going to Europe. And so Ann got to come out to Fort Hood and see me out there. It wasn't that far from Fort Worth. So I get moved, the Army moves me from there to Augusta, Georgia. And I was a military policeman. And the .45 was the handgun used by military police in about 1961. And I couldn't I couldn't shoot the .45. So my captain, realizing that I'm having to hold it up with both hands, and the first time I held it up like this, I put my hand in back of it like this somehow and scraped the back whenever the gun, the .45 rejects, cut my hand. Well, I thought I'd cut my thumb off. And, I didn't weigh anything. I was tiny. I could show you how tiny I was. Who is it that wore my uniform at Christmas? Was it Joey? That's my youngest grandson, who's about 2.5 feet tall. And I got into my closet over there and got my OD jacket that has your stripes on it. And I had 3 stripes. I was a sergeant. And he put that jacket on, and he had a hard time buttoning it. I couldn't believe I was that small. I never thought I was that small. I always thought I was as big as anybody else. And during that time, that probably was when I became addicted to alcohol, because I was I had tried so hard in the to be an officer in the officer candidate school at Fort Benning, and I stayed there until they had what they called a panel, and you would have to go through all of the hard stuff, the running and all of that stuff, pull-ups and all the stuff that they made you do, and then you had to take tests on calibers of weapons and all of that stuff, because in the distant future, Vietnam was brawling, and the Chinese communists were brawling, and President Johnson didn't know quite exactly what he was going to do, and so I was down there trying to be a lieutenant. I had been promoted simply because one reason is I was a golfer, and the colonel was a golfer, and when I got my corporal stripes, they actually gave me what's called a specialist 4th class patch, and I knew that was the same rank as a corporal, but a corporal, you were afforded day room privileges, and you could go to the bar, you could go, and so I wasn't married at that time, so I talked to this colonel, and he wanted me to play golf with him, and so I taught him to play golf, and he changed my Spec 4 to corporal strikes, which made me a junior non-commissioned officer. And then it was shortly after that they gave me a 3rd stripe. So I ended up out of the military as a buck sergeant, E5.
So how did that lead to alcohol, or what led to?
Well, it didn't lead to alcohol. I was constantly. I quit alcohol while I was in officer candidate school, and I was paneled out of officer candidate school not because of something that I did. It was because I was too small. They just weren't going to make a lieutenant out of somebody that was as tiny as I was. I weighed less than 120 pounds, and could do all these things. You know, you had to do 10 chin-ups before you could eat, and I could do those. I almost could do them with one hand. And you take guys that were your size, if they weren't in shape, they just hung there. You know, it was pitiful. And then the officers would come around and beat on them and all that stuff. It's just harassment. So finally, because I'm sure it was my size, it wouldn't have anything to do with my grades, because I was doing everything correct. But every so often they paneled some of these people back into the regular Army to keep the officers the same. And I could tell after I was there about 6 weeks that out of the 18 that I wasn't going to make it. I did everything right, but I could just tell it wasn't right enough. And so I went in to speak to these people, and they told me, they showed me my records, and everything was good. They said, nothing to do with that. We just have a job that we think you're better fitted to. So they sent me to a top security clearance place called Brown Hall. This is where the brilliance of the military finally dawned on me. They were developing a hand-carried nuclear weapon called the Davy Crockett. Now, the hand-carried nuclear weapon that would fire a maximum range of 700 yards. And I couldn't wait to get out of that place. And that's I don't know if that's where I started drinking heavy, but that's where I first started sneaking whiskey into my coffee. And the major that was in there with me, he would sneak a little into his coffee too. So I was in charge of doing the slides on this handheld nuclear weapon that they had. You know, I couldn't, but neither could he. I'd turn around and say, are you listening to this film? What they're saying about how we're going to we're going to cover up with sand? I said, have you seen the pictures of Nagasaki and Hiroshima? What was the sand like over there, for crying out loud? So we ended up out of that place, and they sent me up to the 2nd Infantry Division, and I really liked it. I did well up there. That's when I got my 3rd stripe, and wasn't a corporal anymore. and was a sergeant. And if you saw the movie, you probably didn't see the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Well, the guy that played the Sam Shepard, do you remember that? Played the sergeant. He was my first sergeant.
Oh, really?
And Ann and I were in his house. We visited him. I don't know if he's still alive, but he lived in Fort Benning. His wife had died. And
That guy?
pardon me?
Did the guy that played him in the movie do him justice?
Oh, more than that. I mean, this guy jumped out of. He had 2 parachute jumps in Normandy. He had 4 parachute jumps in Korea, and he had 4 or 6 parachute jumps in Vietnam. He was the #1 non-commissioned officer in Southeast Asia, and he was my top kick. He was Ann and I've been in his house. He has a silver helmet that the veterans of World War I gave him. You know, the doughboy helmet that looks like that. He has that in all silver, and it's engraved on there in appreciation to Basil L. Plumley. And he went all the way through all of that stuff, and got home, and his son or grandson got killed by a car. But I don't know. He literally could still be alive. I mean, he would be in his 90s, but what a man! And we got to see him and talk to him and visit him after the movie people had come in to talk with him. His wife was so thrilled with Mel Gibson and all. That's all she wanted to talk about. But the military was good for me. It's during the military that Ann and I got married, and we couldn't stay away from each other. And I was ready to get married, and so I came back to Lexington, and we married. And my best friend at that time was a lieutenant who lived right across the backyards from our place. We were non-commissioned officers, and we weren't supposed to even be seen with the officers, but as it worked out, we both left the UK, and here we are less than 100 yards apart down in Georgia. So, cut to when we're married and I'm looking for a job in Lexington. He took me to a place in Lebanon called the Jane Todd Inn, which would serve people. If they served me, they would serve a dog, because I didn't look like I was 10 years old. I mean, I've got pictures you can see. You never guess that I was 17 or 18. And they lied about me. I mean, Tom was from Lebanon, so he just told a lie. He just said, "Oh yeah, he's 18 or 21 or whatever it was," and we were down there to watch a ball game on TV supposedly, and that's what got me started. And I liked it. I liked it, and I liked how it felt, and that's what makes a good alcoholic. You just, whatever you're addicted to, you're addicted to it. And that stayed with me. I got out of the service, went to work for First Security National Bank, and was a person that chased people who stole cars from some of our dealerships.
Hold on, there was too much that just happened right there. What was your drink? Were you a beer drinker starting out? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I ended up with anything.
Okay.
So I wasn't that selective. By the time I got down to London as the golf pro, I ran the place. It's like being king of the mountain. You don't have any rules. You set the rules. But the problem was it's in dry option territory, and everything had to be hauled in.
Now, what were you saying there about chasing people that stole the cars off the lot? No, when?
Well,
When
that's
was
the
this?
bank. When
That's
I got out of the service,
It's after the service, okay.
my dad said, Ann and I were married, my dad said, "You have a job waiting on you here as a manager of the Holiday Inn East," which is here in Lexington. And so I didn't hear anything else from my father. We'd packed up the house that we lived in Columbus, Georgia, and she had come back to Lexington, and I was planning on coming back to Lexington and set up housekeeping with the money that the government paid me for serving for 3 years. That was going to buy our furniture, and did buy it right out here in Gardenside. So I'm where am I?
Were you working at the Holiday Inn?
I never got the job. When I hit Lexington, my dad had wanted to call me and tell me, but when I got there, they said, well, she didn't quit. So he's trying his best to, hee-haw around that because he hadn't told me. So I go downtown and park my car, stand right on the corner where the guy is on the horse, John Hunt Morgan, and next door was the First Security National Bank. Now I flipped a coin, heads I go right, left, and it's left, and I walked into the bank, and the first thing happens, just opened the front door in the foyer, and this boy says, Bob Nelson, how are you doing? And it was a friend of mine that I had met maybe once at the University of Kentucky doing who knows what, who now was working for First Security Bank. His name was Frank Barker, and he later on in the Lexington history became the president of, what's his name that had the World's Fair down in Knoxville? Jake Butcher's Bank came to Citizens Fidelity. And so here is Frank working for one of the richest, wealthiest men who he brought the World's Fair to Knoxville. And so he said, you're looking for a job, you can get a job here. And so I became a chase man for the security loan department. They go in and people buy a car, and one car, we went clear down in Manchester, Kentucky, and found the car. We went by a place called Thousand Sticks, and they had a post office. So I went in to the post and sent a letter or sent a card back to Ann with Thousand Sticks post office on it, wrote on there, what a wonderful place this is, da 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 da. And the woman told me where this guy lived that had the car and run off with it. And so we go down and find the car. It's upside down in a creek, and he's joined the military. So that was my. And then I go back and find out that Pat Riley, the basketball player, is now working for First Security, and I'm to feed him. That's my job. Is you don't have to worry about it. He's going to get all the clothes he needs, and of course first thing I did was take him into a men's store, and they couldn't give him enough, which is all illegal, but they did it anyway. And then he rode around with me collecting bad debts until we got to this one lady's house, and she couldn't pay, and Pat felt so bad about it that he started crying, and he said, let's get out of here. And that was the last time I saw him, and he refused to do it. So he, instead of keeping the job with the installment loan department, he goes out on the south end of town, and he becomes a lifeguard at one of the motels out there, and never tells the bank, and the bank's paying him and the lifeguard. This is Pat Riley. And he come home to eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that Ann made in the backyard. Here he is, probably the richest basketball player ever. I mean, right now he's still coaching, and he's all Hall of Fame. And Ann feed him peanut butter and jelly. That's all we had, so he ate what we ate.
That's really funny.
It's amazing. So anyway, there was another boy that worked with me, and we it's called skip chasing, and we chased this guy that stole a car from Vic Hillard Motors, and we saw the guy. We found out where he lived and everything, and I told Jack, I said, well, you get in our car, I'll knock on the door and he'll jump out the window. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened, except he jumped into the truck, the car that he'd stolen, and took off with it. And I had to run real fast to get in our car. So we found him. He was going out toward Georgetown, and he pulled over out where those new developments are and shot at us. So we went to find a policeman, and we ended up catching the guy. And so for that, Mr. Hillard comes down to talk to the bank, and he said, I'm going to tell you about these two boys. And so he gave us, we got his pick, we got the pick of the newest Ford automobile out. And I picked the 1964 and a half Mustang convertible. That was mine. And oh yeah, yeah, they gave it to me. It was mine. I don't know how long I had it, 7 or 8 months. But I was crazy. I mean, I wasn't myself. And I'd do whatever, you know, somebody'd say, let's go here and do this, or let's go there and do that. I said, that sounds good to me. And I remember going down Clays Mill Road, which is this road right out here, going down Clays Mill Road, and we got to Clays Mill Baptist Church. It's the middle of winter, and the top's down on my, and at that time I was in I don't know if I was in the middle of or toward the end of my alcoholism, but whatever it was, I saw the police sitting there beside the Broadway Baptist Church, and I just decided that they must be waiting on me. So I thought, well, if they're waiting on me, I'm backing up. And I took the beer bottle that I had and just tossed it like a hand grenade right in the middle of the 3 police cruisers. And of course, I got pulled over in just a few minutes, and, you know, it was bad. But, you know, it was crazy. And I played golf, and I won a tournament. And so happened that another friend of mine that I had known back when I was crazy, he was a golf pro at Idle Hour Country Club. He knew that the pro out at Tates Creek was looking for an assistant. So I win a tournament at Picadome, and they call each other, and he said, we found you an assistant. So I go to work at Tates Creek Country Club in 1967, because I go to London in 69, 68. So 66, that's the year, yeah, that was the Rupp's Runs. Pat was still out there at the country club swimming. So that's 66 that I'm at Tates Creek, and I'm still really bad now because I can get into the bar, and most of the stuff that I really dreamed of doing were gone. I was lucky Ann didn't leave me. So I leave on one night to get home, and I don't make it. I start side-swiping cars. And the worst car I side-swiped was a woman that was in town for Welcome to Lexington party. And I just go right through her car. And I ended up going to jail in a one of the vans they put dogs in. What? Yeah, but it was the ones they put the dogs in. It was awful. And so, you know, I have no thought of God at this time. Everything I'd ever said to God ended with other words. And so it was not even in my mind what was about to happen to me. So I go to jail, and my dad has to come, and he follows us down to jail. And of course, there are people turning on lights all up and down. I mean, I've wrecked 2 or 3 cars. I almost went through this guy's house, and so must have gone to sleep. And I end up going to jail. Weeks go by, and somebody comes into the golf pro that I'm working for. Things are really bad. I'm sneaking over to the bar, getting a drink, and there's a black guy in there. He's tickled to death. That's the thing about alcoholics. They're people that are trying to kill you. So this guy comes in and says, you know, we were really looking for a golf pro down in London, Kentucky. So Humsey, my boss, guy I play with all the time now. He says, "Ooh, I've got just the guy for you." And so I go home and tell Ann, it never was any, honey, do you think we ought to do this? I'm going to London and be the golf pro. It was almost like the nursery rhyme. I'm going to London to visit the king. And that's what I did. And I took off. Was it January the 1st? It's the first, when I went to London the first time, wasn't it January, the first week of January?
You actually went in '68, yeah,
But the first of the year when I left,
because I stayed up here
and she had to stay 6 months, and she was coming down on the weekends, just looking at this house. It was a 100-year-old house filled with rats and no telling what. It's so bad that one day we hired this guy that was a exterminator. He goes up in the attic, and I said, you know, what did you do up there? I looked and I said, there's droppings everywhere all over the place. He said, I ain't no droppings expert, buddy. So I knew. I said, woo, where am I? They've sent me to this is London, Kentucky. And we built a country club down there. It was the first 18-hole golf course south of I-64 and east of I-75, the very first one. And I built that. And then I stayed there until the coal industry went absolutely berserk in 1973. In 1974, it turned to gold. And I decided to have an open, and I promoted that golf tournament all across southeastern the United States. And we had it on television in eight states. And it was the largest amount of money given to the winner ever in the history of Kentucky. And it was all because coal had turned to gold, and everybody was willing to write you a check. If you made the coal industry look good, they were writing me checks for thousands of dollars that I could have kept, and I never kept a penny of the money, even though the PGA investigated me and tried every way in the world to see that but I had receipts for everything, every dollar that I spent. And but the pros were just jealous. They'd never thought that I could do that, because I'd go to these tournaments with them and get drunk and disorderly and go to jail and all that stuff. Here I was, this outcast golf pro in London. So I had known Ford Philpott when I worked in Lexington at Tates Creek. He was a member there. And I knew he was an evangelist, and therefore I was never going to speak to him. I didn't want to be around him, and was tickled to death when I left to come to London. And I don't know if I was down there 2 years or 3 years, but all of a sudden the Baptist church wanted to have a revival, the Methodist church wanted to have a revival, and the Baptist church was 10 times the size of the Methodist. So they let the Methodist and the Christian church get in, and they decided to have a citywide revival, that they hadn't had one in a while, and they were going to hire Ford Philpott to come and preach it. So when I heard that, I knew that he would end up out at my golf shop, and he'd want to play free. And so that's what happened. But he didn't come himself. He sent an emissary and said, Bob, you know, Ford says that you remember him from Tates Creek. And I said, yeah, I remember him from Tates Creek. Great memories from Ford Philpott. He said, well, you know, he wants to come and play. I said, it'd be great, just fine. Green fees are $15. I said, well, you're not going to charge the preacher, are you? I said, I charge everybody else. Why wouldn't I charge him? He's got money. He can come and play. So he brought with him the comptroller of funds at Asbury College, and I don't know who else, but they all showed up at my pro shop. And so I said, okay, y'all can play. So then the next day he comes out again. And I said, now listen, Dr. Philpott, you know, I work here. This is my job. I can't just keep giving all this stuff from now. So the guy that was coming to talk to me was a Methodist layman named Howard Jones. And Howard had been an alcoholic. He'd been a great golfer. He played with the people that owned Hillrick and Bradsby in Louisville. And he played for war bonds during the Second World War. Chevrolet dealer. He comes to London before I got there, and he's the Chevrolet dealer there, but I know his reputation. So he comes out on the first day of the revival, and he said, Bob, we'd like to have Dr. Philpott and 2 or 3 other of these emissaries. We'd like to get them. You can comp them around the golf. So I said, I'll do it. And I began to, I'm feeling like I've granted amnesty to everybody just because I'm letting this guy play free. Then he comes out the next day. He sends the same guy out. He said, Ford would like to play again. He wants to play with you. I said, I'm not playing golf with Ford Philpott. But I've got right in here somewhere on this wall a big picture of me standing there with my hand on my hip right next to him. So the revival starts. And I go, they take me to the revival. Ann and the kids are gone. I promise them, okay, I'll go. And I still hadn't changed anything. And I go, and here's the high school gym packed with people. Every single one of them knew me. The Otis of Mayberry in London, Kentucky. And not only am I in the ball game, I'm the guy that's running the clock for the basketball game. So I was betting people $20 that I could stop the game anywhere I want to. All they had to do was just take a piece of handkerchief and let me see it anywhere. And if I could see it, I'd just push the button. The referees would come over there and, what is it? And I said, I think this kid's down there, he's lost. He said, looked to me like he's pointing to his eye. Must have lost the contact. So they'd go down and they'd look around. He'd come back over and said, that boy doesn't even wear contacts. And I'd say, oh, man, I'm sorry about that. He said, don't do that again. I'd take $20. And it's just ridiculous stuff like that. So I'm right there in the very front. Now, they're all begging me to go hear Philpott preach. And so I go, and they're waiting on me. And they see me come in, and these guys, they've got a piece of paper that has reserved for ushers on it. So they take me down and sit me down right next to the Baptist preacher's wife. And I mean, it's awful. I can't hardly get my breath. And so Ford's just preaching, and I don't know what he's talking about. He's just, he had a terrible voice. But he starts something, and I started listening. And he's talking about something. The woman that came and washed Jesus' feet. And Mary Magdalene. And that Jesus had said to Mary Magdalene that your name, you will always be famous because of what you did for me. And I started thinking about the time I was in high school when I gave Ann that note, and she didn't like it. And that somehow she married me anyway. And I got thinking about other things about the kids and the good things that had happened. And the next thing I knew, they were singing, Ford was given an invitation, and I'm sitting there thinking about that woman. I don't have anything to give. To whether the Lord wants it or not, what have I got to give him? So I got up and walked over to the bandstand and just stood there. And I didn't know what I thought, but that's where I was. And in 5 minutes, 8,000 people were up there. And Cricket were in the choir. And nobody knew, what in the world was going on except me. I wasn't paying attention to them now. And I was zeroed in on what the preacher was saying. And he was saying, if you trusted Jesus Christ, if you could trust in Jesus Christ, put your faith in Jesus Christ, everything becomes new. And of all the people in the world that wished that that was really true, it was me. But when all those people started coming, I thought, whoa, man, I need a cigarette. I need to get out of here. And I just kind of wormed my way back and got in my truck and drove it back to the golf course. But I was never the same after that, ever. And it took me, I had other things. It doesn't just happen in a thimble, or it doesn't just happen in secret. The Baptist friend of mine that I had, Bob Kidd, invited me. I hope you are, because I'm getting close to it.
Okay, we still got time. Go ahead.
Bob Kidd was a wonderful guy. He and his wife had invited us there many times, and later would invite me back for Bible study. But I was suspicious of everything except what had happened in my heart. That was something that I knew was different now, where the people around me could tell that I was different. I would go into a house and be smoking in the house, and nobody would say a word to me until I left. And then Ann said, do you realize, I would say to Ann, do you realize that they don't have any ashtrays in that house? And she said, well, yeah, they don't smoke. And I said, they don't smoke? It's like I woke up and everybody doesn't smoke. I mean, that's true, isn't it? And I thought, wow, what a jerk. I've gone in there and I tell Ann, I said, I bet you can't get that smell out of the carpet. She said, yeah, it's brand new. They just put it in. And I had never, ever felt bad about doing something like that. But I was just killed. And I was, you don't want to look at anybody. Yet, the very next Sunday, this preacher, our Christian church preacher, comes, and he says, we're going to church today. It's real early, 6 o'clockers. And so he takes us, we all get bundled up, and we go down to this place called Bald Rock Church of Christ. They haven't had a preacher since Noah. And so we go in, and my girls had this big rope, and you can pull this thing, and the bell rings, and the ding, 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 and about a handful of people come. So I get up, and I'm the preacher. He says he's the preacher. Well, I've been arrested. My picture had been in the paper, and all this stuff, DWI and all that. So here I am. He's the preacher. So the little old lady, I don't even know if she could read the paper, but they all look like, oh, Lord, what in the world's happened here? They brought the devil into the pool. So I did the best I could talking about what had happened with Ford, the same story. And the lady comes up and gives me what? $20. I said, what's that for? She said, well, you preached, didn't you? That's what we paid, $20. Yeah. Whoa, what about that? Get paid to just tell stories. So that she wanted me to come back the next week, and I don't remember if we went back or have 3 or 4 times, and nobody was coming, but I started to preach. I started to tell stories from the Bible, and Brother Huey was helping me, and he was a big guy, and I miss him. He's one of my mentors that I oftentimes when I was on the road in 665 meetings, I'd think of Bill Huey and talk to him, like he was in the car with me. But he was just a wonderful, wonderful man. He lost his wife, and I don't remember the last time I think we saw him was in Washington. But anyway, there were so many people that were bolstering me without me knowing that they were doing that. Bob Kidd was one of them, and later on when I had my own ministry, my own preaching as an evangelist, and the bishop appointed me as a general evangelist for not only the Kentucky Conference, but as a general evangelist. I've been to India and Africa and all these places. But back then, there were people like Mr. Kidd, and other people, Sandy Harper and her family, would invite me down, and they read the Bible. Bob, what do you hear about this? What is this? I could tell that I was telling them something that had come from the pages of the Bible that they had never seen. So Brother Huey asked me to preach, and there were some of the men that were elders walked out of the front of the church when I got up to preach. It was a London's Christian church. They didn't want to hear it because they knew all this rotten stuff that I'd done and everything, but it wasn't in me then. I mean, I wasn't mad at anybody. I wasn't, I was just. And so I get this offer to come back. Ford Philpott calls, and he said, I want you to come work for me. And I said, okay. So I left the golf business and moved my family. Well, I'll tell you this little story. I'm trying to move my family, so I tell Ann, look, get the children and put them in the car and go find us a house to live in. I can't go up there because this is a Christian, Bob. Because I can't go up there because I've got to do this and do all this and, well, blah, 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 blah. So Ann gets in the car and goes, I don't know how far she goes, but then she comes back and says, I couldn't find anything. Now I'm really hot. So I get in the car and all the way to Lexington, I'm just yakking, talking to the windshield. And I said, Jesus, what am I supposed to do with this? I have no job. I've got no house. I believe if you could convert me, you could get right in this car right now. And I said, I felt like the door opened. And the next thing I knew, I was in front of my father's trailer. He sold mobile homes out on New Circle Road. I'm pulling right in, and he's going. I said, to the Lord in my car, I said, if you wanted to find us a house, you could use it. You could use a telephone. And I pull into the trailer. My dad's talking on the phone. Says, it's for you. It's this house that we're sitting in right now. And I drive around New Circle Road to come here, and I come in, and the guy's drinking a beer, and I start giving him the testimony, and he takes his foot and scoots that beer back up under the couch. And Ann said she knew then that we were going to get this house, and they kept saying, well, now we're going to put a sign up out there, that you're going to have to pay it, you're going to have to buy it, or else you're going to have to move. And I thought, for the very first time, I wonder what that sign says when people goes by. If the Lord wanted me to have this house, what does it say? Mad dog in the yard? Poisonous grass? Or what does the Lord let them see? Does the sign smell bad? And whatever it was, we didn't have any money. None of this we had any money. Never had any, even still don't. And yet, look at this house. And it's a gift. And I don't know if it works like that for everybody, but it sure worked like that for me. I ended up almost halfway around the world. And now here I am with Alzheimer's. That's my most recent chapter. And some of it's beginning to make sense. I thought Alzheimer's, you're going to forget everything. But I haven't forgotten hardly any of that story. But where I am is I find small things get confusing to me. When I'm supposed to go eat, or when I'm supposed to be off. So we have on the refrigerator my monthly schedule, which I still have a hard time finding, and it's because I'm a golfer. People will call up and say, Bob, can you play golf tomorrow? Are you off? And I'll say, yeah, let me look. And then I go look, and they don't know who called. So it's just, and then I have a choice there to let that just rob me, or I just laugh about it. I enjoy what I'm doing. I mean, I was a golf pro for a long time, and retired from 2 or 3 different jobs, including the United Methodist Church, and still do. Just last week, I held a meeting and just finished writing about it in Nathaniel Mission, which was the very first homeless type food kitchen mission that I had ever seen after I gotten converted in 1975. And they invited me back last Sunday to preach, and in the middle of my sermon, one of the children pulled a fire alarm. So the musicians had to stop, and so did the preacher, and so it was a sort of aborted. But I guess in that particular setting, you sort of expect those kinds of things to happen, and I even appreciate that, how we were able to get through that with no hard feelings, even though there was only half a sermon delivered. I thought for a long time I'll address something that you haven't mentioned, but the Alzheimer's has been in my life and in my thoughts for about 15 years, 12 to 15. Diagnosed maybe 4 to 8 years ago, not exactly sure. Go back into the Sanders Brown clinic at the University of Kentucky, which is noted as Alzheimer's research. They sent me through all kinds of brain scans, and I did crazy little pictures where the nurses would say, Mr. Nelson, what's missing from this picture? And I would look down, and there would be a rowboat that didn't have any oars, or it didn't have any motor, and the lake was still, and there was out of bounds, so to speak. There were houses and so forth, so it looked like a little pond. And she kept saying, "What is missing?" And so I couldn't see that there was anything missing other than there were no oars or no motorboat. So I said, well, there doesn't seem to be a way to get across the lake. Or they never would say, well, that was a great answer, or that's a bad answer, or you're right or you're wrong. It just left me. And they said, are you finished? And I said, yes, I'm finished. And so those were the sort of tests that they gave me. My doctor, Ryan, my very first time that I met him, he said, I'm going to give you 3 couplets. Main Street, John Brown, green grass. Now, I'll ask you if you can remember that each time you come back. And so I went back a year later, and I said, Main Street, John Brown, green grass. And so this past year, this is my 7th year, and he said, do you still remember? And that's as far as I let him get. And I said, Smith, John Street, Main, grass, green. And he said, I'm impressed that I could do it backwards. And but he's a funny little man, and he's one of these doctors that's always, he's got his arms and legs both crossed, and is not very open. But then he brought in a man to us that was a tall, young doctor. And I asked him a question. I said, what is Alzheimer's? I don't seem to be getting any worse or any better. I have the most bizarre things that happen. I forget people that I've known for years, and then it'll come back to me. And so I said, what is it exactly? Nobody's told me. He said, well, you have, it's like telephone poles, and you have electronic synapses that goes across with thoughts, and almost every single thing that happens to you that you see or hear or touch, that those things are constantly firing at each other like a piston in a car, only much more rapid, and by 1,000,000 times. And he said, and plaque forms in between those 2 receivers. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. Did you say plaque, like plaque on the teeth, or that type of physical retardant? He said, that's absolutely right. I said, that's the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life. Up until just now, I thought there was no cure. But I said, I charge you young doctors, figure out how to get rid of that plaque. If it's physical, there must be a way that we can go inside the brain and clean that place up. And he just laughed, and he said, well, that's what we're going to do. And he said, but don't hold your breath because it's going to take some time. I said, listen, I'm one of these guys that looks forward to living forever. You take your time. And he just looked at me. And so, but that's what I think, you know, that does not bother me. I worry more that I'm going to let my car run out of gas than I do about whether I die or whether I live. And it's because I know the Lord.
That's good. What kind of places has your ministry taken you?
Ooh. You know, the toughest part, I think, place, going back to London, where I was the golf pro, and Otis of Mayberry, and misbehaved, even though at the end of that, I ran the largest golf tournament in the history of the state of Kentucky, south of I-64 and east of I-75. It brought a lot of publicity down into that part of the country, and I had many, including the sheriff, many of the officials of London came to me because shortly after that happened, Ford Philpott had called, the evangelist had heard that I had been converted in his meeting, and called me to come to work for him in Lexington, and we had announced that my whole family was leaving the golf business and we were going to go into ministry. And the sheriff came over gave me a ancient gutta perch ball press from Middlesbrough, which was no telling when it came over here, but at least 200 years ago. And they were using it. The Scots would make a golf ball out of a gutta. It's called gutta perch. It's almost like our plastics, and but when you would play with it, it would get knocked out around. And so they had this press that two big pieces of iron, and they went around the ball like that, and then the golf club maker would hit it with a hammer and knock it back into round, and charge a shilling or two pence or something like that to fix the golf ball. And I didn't know what it was. And it was 1975, and there was a brand new set of irons out, Wilson Staff, 1975, and bullet backs they were called. And I wanted that set of irons so bad. And so I traded something I didn't know about to another golf pro who knew exactly what it was for a set of $200 irons. And years later, I was preaching up in New York, and the people asked me, have you ever been to the golf house, the museum? I said, no, I haven't. Is it close here? And they said, yeah, it's only about 20 minutes. So Ann and I went up, and there in the middle of the whole thing, underneath glass, was my gutta perch press, and they estimated its value around $35,000. So I didn't get into ministry to make any money, and if I had, I feel like I've given more of it away than. But I've loved every minute of it. I dearly love the people, and the people.
Were you saying going back to London was tough?
You mean London, Kentucky?
Yeah, going back to London, Kentucky was tough.
I went back. Only been back once since I left. So when I was converted, that was in '75. And I have wanted to go back to preach at the Baptist preacher's a friend of mine, and I see him all the time in the sporting goods store where I'm spending my days now. And he was telling me he'd have me back down there, but he's a Southern Baptist, and he knows that I was a United Methodist. And I think also he knows I have a real story. And I haven't even gotten to that story yet, which was one of the great things that ever happened to me in my life happened just a year ago. And it has to do with Alzheimer's. 10 years ago, we met a couple named Robbie, and I'll think of it in a minute, Donna. Their last names were Robinson. And they met in the Army, and they married, fell in love, and they married. And I met Robbie at a golf tournament. and I found out that his wife was a champion golfer down in Carolina, and that they had met, and because of golf and because of other things, there's, by the way, you could take that big book right there and have something firm to write on.
I'm okay.
You're
Yeah. No,
that worries me to death when I don't have something solid. But anyway, she started a business up here called Donna's Tails a Wagon, and what she did was groom pets, and she had this really cute looking painted the dogs all over it, and they would come to my golf tournament, the Ford Philpott Memorial Tournament in Daytona Beach, which Ford had for 30-something years, and I've been running it for 10 or 12 years. And we'll have 100 people go down there every October. It's the second week of October to come play golf, and then we always have devotions, and it doesn't matter who comes. And a lot of the people are non-Christians, so we have devotions every day at night or in the morning, one of the two, depending on opposite of whenever we're playing golf. We have these devotions. We have prayer requests. We sing hymns in the hotel, and then we go play golf. Or we go play golf and then come back and do that at night. And then we have a banquet. And so prior to this last year, during the year, the doctors called me back in, Sanders Brown, and told me about how bad my Alzheimer's had become. And somehow that got to the fellow that I was working for at Picadome Golf Course, and this is her ex-husband. So we're talking about Donna and her ex-husband Robbie. And she is now been converted from a United Methodist to a Pentecostal group in North Carolina. And the preacher in the North Carolina section hears the story about my Alzheimer's, and Donna calls her ex-husband, who called me and said, "We are praying for you in North Carolina, and we believe that you're going to be healed, but Donna has to come to Lexington and wash your feet. That God has told this preacher that they have to come and wash my feet, and that if I will allow that and let her have a prayer, that my Alzheimer's will go away, that I won't have any Alzheimer's anymore." So she called her ex-husband Robbie to use his apartment to do this in, then calls me and tells me all that what I just told you. So I said, well, bring it on. I don't know a thing in the world about Alzheimer's. I know my doctor says there's no cure for it. So let's prove him wrong, and it doesn't bother me. I'll stick my feet in the bathtub or the toilet bowl or wherever you say. We have 3 times in my whole ministry, we had foot washing service at St. Andrews, at the Methodist Church. All 3 times, this is all I knew about the foot, other than the scripture. All 3 times, there was somebody converted in the service who didn't talk about it until the midweek. They would call me and said, "Brother Nelson, there was something that more happened in that foot washing service than just cleaning my feet." And I said, well, I wonder if that was what they said to Jesus too. Because I didn't know what to say to it. You know, pastors were not infinitely brilliant, especially ex-golf pros. So I said, Donna, you know I love you. Ann and I love you. And we love Robbie. And we didn't even know about the divorce. But if you think the Lord has told you that, and if you want to come all the way up here, I will meet you anywhere you say. So I met her in this, and she had this towel, and she had the scripture all laid out, and she knew what she was going to do with, and she was going to pray this and pray that. And so she knelt down and poured this basin full of it, and then she brought this oil in and poured. And she began to weep. Tears was dropping into the pan. And she took her hair and wiped my feet with it. And, I could hardly swallow. I thought, Lord, I'm not a charismatic. I'm not sure what's going on. But I do not want to hurt this woman. I do not want her. If this doesn't work, I don't want to hurt her. Now you have to help me here. Either do something or get me out of it. It's just, you've got me in between a rock and a hard place. I'm talking to God, telling him that. And a little bit upset about it. Because the more we got into it, the more I could see it's going to hurt her if something real doesn't happen. We finish. She asked me to have a prayer. I prayed. She goes back to tell her ex-husband what went on, and that how the Lord had told her I no longer had Alzheimer's. And so time goes by, and I show up at my golf tournament. I led one of my best friends to the Lord, got him out of jail, prayed with him, and he's a Christian. And he's a golf pro named Kenny Hall. And Kenny is funny as he can be, and he's going to be my co-host this particular last year. And I'm not going to talk about Alzheimer's, or I'm not going to talk about anything. I'm not going to talk about Donna, even though Donna's ex-husband and his new wife and family are sitting out there in the audience watching me. Not going to talk about it. So we're giving away the prizes. It's time for me to speak on whatever. And I start talking about going to India. I have no idea where. I said, I had something I was going to say, but I said, have I told you all about being in India, in a village where there was nobody that ever seen a white man, in northern the province of something Nadu, the first word, and then Nadu. And they hadn't seen a car. We drove up, they hadn't seen a car. There's a little path, I have pictures of it, there's a little dirt path. There's a girl about 14 years old underneath a hut that's almost all the way down here. She's got a little fire of sticks and got a piece of chicken, looks like a bird of some kind, that she's fixing herself to eat, on a path that's not 18 inches wide. And at the end of that path, they'd set up a table, and they'd set up one of these battery type things that'll let the lights run for a little bit. And so I didn't know. And then the guy tells me, the missionary says, now Bob, you can't refer to Jesus here because they've never heard of Jesus. And you can't refer to any of the Christian, they don't have any idea what the Christian is. And the little boy had gotten some sort of there was a little boy about like 5, and he'd come up, he kept pointing to his chest. And finally the light was good enough that I could see that he had on a baseball shirt that somebody had sent, in a package, a care package. This was a baseball shirt, had a white guy with a baseball bat, and he's pointing me and the face on that shirt that we're both white. And, and I thought, man, where am I? And then they start telling me, they don't know about Jesus. God is a butterfly or bees or an elephant or an ox or something like that to the Hindus. And so I'm looking, and we have a monsoon coming, a big, horrible black cloud coming this way. To the right, the sun is just going down. So we have a monsoon coming in. The sun's going down in the west. Just, it's fiery red, beautiful. And so I say to him, and the Guna Kumar, who's the evangelist, he said, go ahead, Bob, and preach. And I said, I'm not sure you're going to understand what I say, but you see the sun in the sky, and the sun this is where I came from. I came from a place where the sun is going. And I came not to tell you about that Son, but about God's Son. And that God's Son has come into this world to bring light into the darkness of your world. And He can only do that through the power and majesty of His Son, who is the King of all of the universe. And so then I prayed with them. And when I opened my eyes, that's all I said. Now it's dark. And they've got this one big long neon light bulb. It's got sort of bluish green stuff. And I'm still standing here behind this little ledge. It's about a table about this tall. And this big guy that had had this spear in his hand when I got there, he had laid the spear down when I'd opened my eyes after I prayed. He'd laid the spear down and he was on his knees. And he had told this guy in Indian, whatever, they told me what the name of it was, what the language was. But anyway, it was his language. And he had told him that Christ had come into his heart. He had invited Jesus into his heart, and he had come into his heart. And when that happened, Guna says, "How do you know? How do you know?" And he said, "I don't know. But he has come into my heart." And I'm listening to that. So here I am at a banquet where everybody thinks I've lost my mind anyway. And I've told them this big foot washing story. And now here I am talking about India. And people are crying. Robbie had his two daughters, neither one of them were converted. And I said, let me just tell you what this is. I know some of you don't trust the Lord. Some of you don't know the Lord, been going to church all your life. And I said, you cannot put me on this spot. I may not be able to say these same things next year when we come to Florida. But today you have a chance. And I said, let's bow. And I had them all bow their heads, and I prayed a sinner's prayer with them. And I said, now you can leave me alone now. I've given you away. I don't have to deal with you anymore, Ed. I start calling them by their first names. I don't have to deal with you anymore. This guy's got cancer. His ears are falling off. He won't stop playing golf. He's out in the sunshine. He's got sunspots everywhere. It's like he has leprosy. I said, Ed, I released you. I can't pray for you anymore. The Lord has you. And so I ran into him about a week ago. He says, you were right about the Lord. I said, well, how's that cancer? He said, well, I don't think it's going away, but it doesn't hurt at all. So it's just, you cannot describe the surprises that God has in dealing with His people. Not dealing with me, but when through Him I'm dealing with His people. You can never imagine it if you sit down and try to make a film of it. You can't do it. So that was my last mission trip. I was in Africa. I told you that story, and I got to preach. I got the call to go to preach in Scotland. That was a great trip, and not Brussels. Ann will know the name of it. It's one of these big English. I had to walk up in a corner, like in a Catholic church here. You're going real high in the corner and get up there and preach. I preached on John 3:16. And he said, what, the guy was wondering what I was going to preach on. Was I going to do discernment, da-da-da-da? I said, no, I'm going to preach the simplest sermon in the Bible. And now I did. I stood there, and I was scared to death that thing was going to fall off the wall. You had to walk up around like this, and you stepped into it. Have you ever seen one of those churches? Huge. And all cold as it can be. And I gave an invitation. I said, I don't know how you do this in wherever I was. I was outside of Scotland. I was in the next little country beside Scotland. Anyway, Ann will know when she comes in here. But, gave an invitation. And so I was able to say when I stopped, my ministry when I thought it was over. That I never preached a sermon without giving an invitation for something, and still haven't. So I don't know if I get called back out again, but I'm ready to go. I went last week down to the mission, and one of the kids set the fire alarm off right as I was right in the middle of the but nobody cared, you know. This is a mission church, and they were used to everything bizarre happening, and so I said, well, I told the woman that was running, I said, if you want me to come back, I'll finish the story or start all over for you. She said, well, I'll call you.
That's good. That's good. Good stuff.
Well, I'm glad you